The UK Prime Minister and Labour leader on the left, Italy's Prime Minister on the right. But they could soon be in lockstep, apparently, when it comes to the trade in trafficking human life. Sir Keir Starmer said today he was opening a new era with Europe and the partnership with Italy more important than ever. This wasn't just an exercise in glad-handing,
This way.
but fact-finding. Where the boats come from may differ, but Sir Keir Starmer was at this Coast Guard centre just outside Rome this morning to hear how to make them stop, he says, making the journey in the first place.
Here there's been some quite dramatic reductions, so I want to understand how that came about. It looks as though that's down to the upstream work that's being done in some of the countries where people are coming from. I've long believed, by the way, that prevention and stopping people travelling in the first place is one of the best ways to deal with this particular issue. So I'm very interested to know how that upstream work went.
One man paying close attention, Martin Hewitt.
Martin.
The man whose job it is to tackle the UK's small boat crisis as head of the new Border Security Command. The scale of his task, more than 1,000 people arrived on UK shores over the weekend, risking it all to get here. 8 people drowned off the coast of Calais in the early hours of Sunday. Italy now plans to process migrants in Albania. It's different to the Conservatives' Rwanda scheme because under that scheme, those granted asylum had to stay in Rwanda. Briefings before Sir Keir's visit to Rome played up his interest in Albanian processing centres. How interested, though, depends on which Prime Minister you listen to.
Italy-Albania agreement and the UK government has shown great interest in this agreement.
We've discussed the Albania arrangement, which isn't up and running yet, as you know, and therefore we don't yet know the outcome of it, but we've discussed the concept.
For some Labour MPs, it's been a difficult watch listening to the Prime Minister praise the person who said this back in 2019.
Sink and demolish the boats.
The ships she wanted sinking, rescue boats that patrolled the Mediterranean. Now in government, Italian migration policies leave little to be admired, say critics.
The way they've done it is essentially by offering large sums of money to African countries that have a dubious human rights record to try and clamp down on people who are wanting to come to Europe seeking safety. And I think that should raise serious questions in the minds of this government when it looks behind the detail and the rhetoric and the approach that Meloni and Europe are taking.
The number one priority, says Sir Keir, is stopping people boarding boats in the first place. But dealing with those that still do is a policy maze, which all European nations are yet to find an escape from.
Well, let's talk more about this with Tony Smith, who's a former Director General of the UK Border Force. Tony Smith, Keir Starmer there saying that he's interested in this Albanian processing centre that Italy's set up. Could the UK do something similar? If so, where?
Well, actually, the UK was doing something similar with Rwanda, not the same. The Albanian plan, I think, is that, people can be sent to Albania for processing, and if they're successful, they'll be brought into Italy, whereas that wouldn't have been the case largely with Rwanda. But I think this is really a cut and paste of quite a lot of elements of the British Rwanda plan that's been installed in Albania. So I'm really interested to see how that's going. Of course, that's not in place yet. And I think, as we know from our own experiences with setting up Rwanda, there are a huge amount of legal difficulties, of practical difficulties in offshoring. But it's clear that, to me, that a number of countries, not just Italy, are really looking at the offshoring model. So it's interesting that our government is now looking at that as well.
Well, there is a big difference, though, isn't there, with the Rwanda policy? People were sent there, and even if their claims were successful, they wouldn't get to come to the UK. But, could the UK pick a different country from Albania to do something similar?
Well, I'm not sure where we'd go. I think there was quite a lot of work already done, Cathy, on that during the last 3 years by the previous government, and Rwanda was a place where we already had a migration and economic development partnership. There was a lot of money already going into Rwanda. We built an asylum system there. We signed a treaty with them to ensure that nobody would be refoulement from Rwanda, whether or not they qualified for asylum. So a huge amount of work and effort was put into the Rwanda plan. And it's clear now that a number of European countries were looking at that, I suspect including Italy, which is where I suspect this idea of Albania has come from. Of course, they do have the geographical advantage. Albania is quite close to Italy, but still remains to be seen how that would work. Is that going to withstand international scrutiny in international law? What happens if people go to Albania and then just come straight back again into Italy? How is that all going to work? I think there's a lot of detail still to be worked out in that scheme. And so at the moment, I'm not quite sure that that's the solution.
OK, so are there other solutions? For example, might the UK have more luck sending people back to France than the previous government did, given that, you know, European countries are happy to send migrants apparently to Libya and Tunisia with very dubious human rights records?
Well, I think that's the question, really, is why is it OK from an EU point of view on their southern border with places like Tunisia and Libya to return people there whilst at sea? Yet we know full well that, you know, off the coast of France, people are drowning because the French are not taking the same approach. That actually their approach is, well, people don't want to be rescued by us, so we're not going to intervene. We're going to escort them across to the Meridian line where the UK Border Force can pick them up. That does seem to me a very starkly different policy between the EU on their southern border, on their northwestern border with us, that I think we need to call out, because after all, France is a lot safer, if you like, for returns, for third country returns than places like Libya and Tunisia, and yet the EU seems to be sanctioning that, and indeed they've been funding it.
Do you think there's a hypocrisy there that Keir Starmer should sort of stand up to France over?
Well, Mr Macron's position, as I understand it, is that we need to talk to Brussels about this. This is a matter of EU competence. If we want to do third country returns to the EU, we need to talk to Brussels. But then I presume Brussels can oversee policy in all of the member states on this. And so, you know, I think we should call out the EU policy on rescues at sea, right, because it is a fundamental principle of the law of the sea that people should be rescued and made safe quickly, and that seems to be different standards to me down on their southern border to their northwestern border.
Isn't the reality that desperate people from countries like Afghanistan and Iran will carry on coming across on boats, you know, because Labour, for example, the new Labour government is not countenancing new, safe and legal routes? There's a problem there, isn't there?
Well, I'm not opposed to safe and legal routes as a matter of principle, but the traditional safe and legal routes come through the UNHCR resettlement programs, where there are already about 40 million people in the care of UNHCR around the world. Now, what used to happen is that those UNHCR would bid to different countries, including us and the Europeans and the Americans and the Canadians, to take a certain proportion of those, the most vulnerable, and they would be lawfully resettled. Unfortunately, because we've had the huge wave of migrants moving across borders irregularly, that's been taken over by the international criminal gangs. Politically, a great deal of the Western countries that used to, you know, take significant numbers under that scheme have stopped doing so, because they're dealing with sheer numbers of migrants, some of whom may be genuine refugees, some of whom are not. So I'd like to see a return to discussions with the EU, but I can't see that happening until we can get a control of our borders.
Yeah. Tony Smith, thanks very much for joining.